And I'm going to give people one more minute till we get to 4:02 and not a second later. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jack Reitz. I am the Director of Engagement with Jewish for Good. You are here the first day of the Jewish Authors Book Festival. I see some familiar faces, which I certainly appreciate, and some familiar faces from years past, which is it's really fun. Grateful that y'all are coming back. Grateful to be here. The Jewish Authors Book Festival is a joint venture with Lifelong Learning, Bethel, and Jewish for Good. And I am, despite the times that we are living in, it's wonderful to see faces and get people here from, at this point, all over the country, zooming in to participate in this festival. That is my brief introduction. Elazar, I'm going to pass it off to you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Elazar Nudell, a member of Bethel Synagogue and the Lifelong Learning Committee. Welcome to or back to the Jewish Authors Book Festival. We'll be taking questions after we hear from this afternoon's author, so stay tuned throughout the program. And if you would, please type any questions you have into the chat, which we'll collect for after Riva speaks. Riva Lehrer is an artist, writer, and curator who focuses on the socially challenged body, best known for representations of people whose physical embodiment, sexuality, or gender identity have long been stigmatized. Lehrer's memoir, Golem Girl, published by One World Penguin Random House, won the 2020 Barbellion Prize for Literature and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. She is represented by Regal Hoffman and Associates of New York City and by Zola Lieberman Gallery of Chicago. With that, I am delighted to introduce Riva Lehrer.
Hi, everyone. I encourage people to turn on your cameras unless you are seriously camera shy. It's nice to be able to see that there are people out there as I drone on here in my space. I'm actually in my painting studio, which I just moved into 2 weeks ago. I'll give you a little look at where I am. So there's a little Chicago out there. And right behind us, right there, is a very large painting I'm working on. And maybe later I'll turn us totally around. Anyway, thank you for being here. It's probably a nice day where you are and you're like, why am I inside? Why? So thanks. So I've primarily been a visual artist for most of my career. And years ago, I started to write a document that I wanted to leave for my family because I knew that they would be my art executors and that I wanted to leave them something that if a museum or a collector or something wanted to know about my work, I'm thinking, God, what's my family know about what I do? So I start writing this thing. And it's always been the case, and you know this if you've read the book, that in order to describe the work that I do, I've had to tell some personal stories about how I ended up doing it. And as I'm writing this thing, I don't even remember what the question was, but I thought, oh, there's this thing I don't really know about the family and it pertains to what I'm doing. And so next time I go home, I should ask. So next time I went home to Cincinnati, I think it was 2014, I sat down with a couple of my elderly aunts and uncles and started asking questions. And they started to tell me stories about my family that, I had to tape my jaw back onto my face by the time they'd finished telling me the secrets. And it just changed everything. I started to write a book instead of a curatorial document. But it took a long time. And I was incredibly lucky to be picked up by Penguin Random House. And the result, if you have not seen it already, is this. So that's my book. I don't know if it shows up backwards on screen. It's always confusing to me. Okay, it shows up backwards on my screen. But the thing about it is that it's not only a memoir. My press did this thing, which hardly anybody does, sometimes called color on page. So for instance, this is one of the chapters, and you can see one of my paintings there. And normally when you have a book with a lot of images, I'm in a very noisy space. There are people who scream out on the street, and there's a church next door. I mean, literally one door down that's holding services. So there may be screaming children there and screaming neighbors there. So it's a little bit like a chorus of weirdness happening. Anyway, so the book, what I was afraid they would do is, we've all seen it where a book has like a chunk of photo paper stuck in it. And as you're reading, you get to this section of photo paper and you flip through all the pictures, and then you go back to the sort of text pages. But it was really important to me that my visual work, which is so entwined with every story, be there to sort of move along and comment on and be intertwined with the text. And they did it. So as you're reading the book, pay attention to what painting or drawing there is at the beginning or during the text, because there's a reason for it to be there. It's not an illustration. It's my standalone work, but it definitely comments on the text. So speaking of text, I'm going to read a chapter that is one of the more Jewish of the chapters in the book. And I'm going to do it by reading on screen. So I will be staring fixedly at my text. One second. Where are you? No, my doc is not showing me. Second. Come on. Okay. So the name of every chapter in the book is named after a horror movie or a horror novel, because I wanted to keep the theme of living as a monster maintained through the book. So this chapter is called Face Off, which is after that John Travolta, Nicolas Cage ridiculous movie where they swap faces. I've had to describe to my anatomy students so many times how that can't really happen that way, but it's a nice fantasy. Anyway, chapter 24, Face Off. The great milestone of Jewish womanhood was the nose job. All around me were girls under the exact same spell of body dysmorphia. What a nice change it made, not to be alone in colossal self-loathing. Every single one of us was convinced that rhinoplasty was the route to beauty. For me, my nose had become my body in miniature. Too sizable, too wide, too lumpen, too visible by far. I was certain that if my nose was corrected, the rest of me would magically follow. Nowhere, oh, I'm sorry, I was 16 years old at the time. Nowhere was this desire more acute than during summers at the JCC pool. It had been easier when I was 12, when my friends and I had splashed and dunked each other, wearing one-piece suits patterned with fishies and whales. We couldn't wait to be teenagers. And now, at 16, we ran a lot less and posed a lot more. In the 1970s, ethnic diversity had yet to arrive in Cincinnati. Our ambition was to be as undiverse as possible. My friend Nancy had been asking her parents for a nose job since she was 11, until in desperation, she made herself swim directly into the concrete wall of the JCC pool. She was sure that they had to come through now, since Nancy could hardly go through life with the schnoz of a Ukrainian prize fighter. Nancy was but the most intrepid of the rhinoplasty devotees of Roselawn, my neighborhood. Walk down the sidewalk and a Dr. Peerless nose came at you from one direction, while another identical Dr. Peerless nose passed you going south. Sidney Peerless was the plastic surgeon who remodeled all the Shayna Maedalas of middle-class Cincinnati. Like Nathan Hale, he had but one nose to give to his country. The doctor was famous for whittling cartilage into teensy little shiksa buttons. This was the first time I'd ever asked for a surgery, a very perverse act of adulthood. And hey, lucky me, Sidney Peerless was my father's client. Dad even looked so much like Peerless that they played the same joke every time. Sid put a lab coat on Jerry and sent him down the hall where my father would poke his head in every exam room and promise, "I'll be right with you." Sid and Jerry thought this was hilarious. But my parents said no, too expensive. I looked fine. I whined, sure what I did. I whined and wheedled until they relented. Peerless peered inside my nostrils and discovered his 10,000th deviated septum, yet one more of the epidemic of deviant septa sweeping the Jewish community. This was a kindness to my father. Peerless's diagnosis meant that Blue Cross Blue Shield would cover my nose, as it were. I lay on Peerless's exam table and explained that I did not want him to tilt my nose upward. I only wanted it narrowed, and please preserve the hook. The doctor's jaw dropped. This was a new one on him. But you'd be such a pretty girl. Here, let me show you. He picked up a mirror and gloved hands pushed my nostrils skyward. See? What I saw was a man with a serious fetish. I balked, but if you tilt my nose, I won't look like Cher anymore. It was embarrassing to admit, but I loved when people said, "You're just like a miniature Cher." This was largely down to my hair, which hung past my waist in a thick red-black flag. I cannot talk today, I'm sorry. Middle-aged moms and skeezy older guys alike asked if they could touch it. I couldn't do anything about my height, but Cher's profile was within my grasp. I liked looking Jewish. I just wanted to look elegantly Jewish, like Cher. He sighed and acquiesced. I woke up in the recovery room and touched my face. His betrayal was obvious, even under the swaddle of bandaging. When the packing and the gauze came out, my new nose indeed pointed skyward like every other Peerless nose. Worse, the damn thing was asymmetrical. Not only did the tip have a rubbery bump the size of a lentil, the whole thing careened to the right. Accident? Intention? Or perhaps my body just refused to be normal, to blend in, to be anything other than its own peculiar self. My life would have been different had I listened to that lesson. After all, it was plain as the nose on my face. Thanks. So let's get rid of that. For people who might not have read the book, what I'm talking about there is one aspect of growing up with a visible disability. I'm very visibly disabled. I'm 4'9". I walk with a major limp. I've got orthopedic shoes the size of Studebakers. And I've been stared at and pointed at and had horrible things said to me my entire life. And that moment in time when everyone around me wanted this surgery and everyone around me thought that this would make them acceptable, it really enraptured me. The longing to be normal had put me through so many surgeries. And it wasn't that I was asking for those surgeries, it was that the adults in my life kept worrying about the way I walked, there were surgeries that were necessary to save my life, but a lot of the surgery I've had over the years, if you really look at it, was about being normalized. And it's taken me most of my life to see that and to understand that that's true for so much of us, that even surgery to make you walk more normally, yes, it probably takes stress off of one's bones and muscles, but it also makes you more acceptable. So I grew up at a time in the 60s and 70s, before the ADA and before even curb cuts, the IDEA, the Educational Equal Rights sort of Act, all the things that we know now with the things that have come with the ADA, as damaged as it's been by the Republican administrations who have taken it over each time. And the ADA has been severely watered down, but it still gives us some rights. But my life took place, my upbringing took place rather, before any of that. And at the time, there really was no place for me in society. And most people like me were institutionalized from birth, just about, as children, or they lived in the bedroom of their parents, a back room of the family home. Didn't really go out much because, if your house wasn't ramped and you had a mobility impairment, that's its own hell. But also to go where? If you couldn't have a job and you couldn't really go to school and no one expected you to date, and on and on and on, you might go out with your family to do the shopping or something. But most people's lives were very, very limited. My mother, as you'll read, was a major exception. And I don't want to give away the plot if you haven't read it, but she did refuse to institutionalize me. And so way down the road, I went to art school. And when I went to art school, I fell in love with portraiture. But again, it took me years to realize that there were no disabled people in the history of portraiture as shown to me. There were a lot of very pretty and powerful and historically important people in all these portraits. But, certainly there had to have been disabled people, but you wouldn't have known it by the history of painting. So after I left school, and I tried a little bit in school to start doing work about impairment. I was incoherent, I was terrified. I was looking to my instructors to please give me some direction. And instead they just said, don't do it. This is just therapy and you're never going to have a career if you make, images like this. And it wasn't until I was in my late 30s and had spent my adulthood running away from facing the fact that I was disabled. I'd practically bite someone and draw blood if they tried to talk to me about it. But in my late 30s, I met this group of people who were the innovators, the founders, some of the founders of disability culture. And what they gave me with their writing and art and performance and poetry and dance was language to understand my experience. All I had thought about until then was that being disabled was tragic, that my life was tragic. I didn't want to be who I was in any way, shape, or form. And I thought it was all my fault. And these people that I met, they had analysis and politics, perspectives and humor, and they saved my life. So what I started doing after that, starting in the late 90s, was I started to want to make portraits of people, originally people with disabilities. Since then, my practice has opened up to various other kinds of stigma, including sexual identity, gender identity, racial stigmatizations, anything that gets you told that your body is a mistake. So for a few minutes, I'm going to show you some of the portraits, and then I'm going to stop talking and hope that you guys have things to tell me and questions to ask. So I'm going to share my screen somehow. Come on, Zoom. I've been having just a real technical festival today. Hang on. Okay, here we are. And share screen. And this. And I'm gonna collapse that. Oh, sorry, people. So here's the cover of my book, but the next image, that should have worked. Let's try that. Is the full painting that the book cover is a detail of. My entree to making difficult images really were my self-portraits. They're always hard for me to make. They're always me trying to get to a new place with who I am. So this is from 1999. This is the period that I was making portraits of others. And it's a large gouache painting on handmade paper. I'm not going to show you everything. Let's see. So the original portraits that I did a series called Circle Stories. And those were the people that I met during that period in the late 90s. One of them was Hollis Sigler. I hope somebody out there has heard of her because she's vastly unrecognized. But Holly had first been famous for doing paintings about lesbian identity and relationships in a very sort of, they were paintings of scenes where the women appeared as dresses. There's a lot of mythology, a lot of work about longing and desire. And then she developed breast cancer, and it had run in her family. She had a show at the National Museum of Women in the Arts in DC called Walking with the Ghosts of My Grandmothers, in which she did dozens of paintings and drawings about life, about being in fear of death, being in the presence of life, being in relationship with people who you don't want to lose, but all of it done mostly without identifiable figures, done with classical statuary and dresses. So anyway, Holly had been a mentor to me when I first moved to Chicago. She was a huge, huge hero of mine, and I was awestruck when I first met her. And her cancer she'd go into remission, and then that would end, and then she'd go back into remission, and then that would end, and this went on for 20-something years. There came a point that there were no more remissions. And I had asked her over the years if I could do her portrait. And all of a sudden it was clear that there wasn't much time left. And I was afraid to ask her because I wanted her to have her time to do her work. But she said yes. And so this is from that first series of Circle Stories from 2000. I think it's next to the last piece that I did. And she's Persephone, the goddess who goes to the underworld for half the year. And when she goes to the underworld, it's winter. And when she comes back to be with her mother, it's spring again. So here is spring on the left, and one of Hollis's figures preceding her, if you can see it kind of dimly on the right, holding this glowing orb. There are pomegranates everywhere with the seeds bursting out, thinking about breasts sort of breaking their bounds. So this is a painting, because I'm not going to show everything, but it was such an honor that Holly said yes, when I knew that every minute was precious at that point. Right, it's not letting me do it that way. Oh, good gosh. This is, the next series I did were all charcoal drawings. This is a Jewish woman named Nomi Lamb. She became a rabbi at a sort of radical yeshiva in Chicago years ago, and still practices as sort of a spiritual leader. Now she's in Berkeley. This was a series about using one's imagination to deal with trauma, and the way that we have symbols that we hold on to, heroes, power objects, spirit animals, all these different things that help us cope when we're really kind of destabilized by experience. So this is Nomi Lamb underwater with a seal and singing, and you can see the bubbles coming up as they're singing together, and it rises into a single song. So Nomi, you can see her prosthetic leg to the sort of right behind the seal. You guys might, oh geez, why is it doing this? Sorry. Some of you might recognize Matt. Oh, I think I'm not supposed to show nudes at synagogues. I'm not sure about that, so we'll just skip over a couple. Some synagogues, or Jewish groups rather, have said yes, some have said no, so forgive me if I was inappropriate. This is Lynn Manning, poet, actor, founder of Watts Village Theater in LA. Lynn was, so I should explain, when I do a portrait, what I do is I sit down with the person for days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, depending on who it is, and I interview them. And I ask them to tell me the story of their lives, and especially how does the nature of their body affect their work. And I take away their stories and I work up thumbnails and I bring them back, and we discuss which ones are truest to their own experience. So I'm just going to go quickly through a few, but imagine for each one of these, behind each one is a very long and deep conversation, or rather conversations in which we learn to trust each other. Sorry, my mouse is doing really strange things. Self-portrait with a wedding dress, thinking about the way I was raised to believe I would never have a relationship. The nude I showed you before and Liz Carr here, they're both very famous British actors. Some of you may be seeing them in streaming things like American Horror Story and His Dark Materials and Silent Witness. And Liz and Matt, you know, I met a lot of the American pioneers of disability culture. Liz and Matt are the two people in London who together changed how the BBC address disability, how they treat their actors, how they write contracts. And I've become friends with both of them, both here, you know, when they're over here doing gigs and when I go to London. So this is Liz Carr. Let's see what my mouse decides to do. Just going to show a couple more. This is somebody I bet a lot of you do know, Alison Bechdel, who wrote the memoir Fun Home. It became a huge Broadway hit and won the Tony Award, multiple Tony Awards, I think 4 years ago, something like that. Alison was famous for a series of graphic novels and comic strips called Dykes to Watch Out For. Just an absolute icon of the lesbian community. And when she decided to stop doing that and begin writing memoir, there was a lot of backlash, people who were very unhappy with her. So we were friends, and I wanted to do a portrait about, yes, the screaming man is back. I hope you can't hear him. About looking backwards. Her first memoir was about her father, and she was writing the second one, which is called Are You My Mother? Obviously about her mom. So I had her come to my studio. I gave her a pull with a pen on it and a mirror, and I asked her to draw herself backwards. So she started doing, that was quite something. But later when she went back to Vermont, where she lives, I sent her just the drawing of her against the room, nothing else, like charcoal tracing. And I said, draw your mother in there somewhere. I don't know where she's going to be, but draw what you're thinking about your relationship with her right now. So she sent me this incredible drawing of her mother reading her book and ignoring Allison, which a lot of the memoir is about, her mother being very withholding. And what's remarkable is that the only place where Allison and her mother are truly together is in the reflection of the mirror. Allison has her back to her mother's looking down, but in the mirror, they're together. But if you look at the shadow of the mirror on the wall, and Allison told me this was totally accidental, the smoke crosses out the mirror. And in psychoanalytic terms, that's called a primary wound. And so her mother is negating the place where they're together. And I hand transferred Allison's drawing onto the portrait. Okay, let's see. It's curator, a novelist. Oh gosh, how are we for time? Let me take a look. Oh, we're about out of time for me to ramble on. I'm just going to show some images, stop screen share, and then if there's one that you want to talk about, write down the title and I can answer questions. So Tim Lowley, Tim Owl. Oh, that's complicated. Sherry Dragon. These are 3D, by the way. I do want to explain that this, and so the snowstorm is up on pins. So it's 3 inches off the drawing itself. So during the day, as light changes in the room, the shadow of the snow shifts across the piece. So these are collaged in 3D. The owl is fully 3D. It's made of, in part, of Bible pages, and the wings come off the drawing by about 4 inches. So Tim is a charcoal drawing and the owl is a construction. Same here. This is another self-portrait. The needles are real. They're both veterinary and quilting needles, and the dolls are 3D. This is completely 3D, called At 54, thinking about who I was at that point. And I'm now just about 10 years older. I'm going to be 64 in a couple weeks rather. A recent self-portrait that I'm fond of, a fairly large drawing, 66 degrees. These are collaborative. These are pieces in which the person sitting for me is left alone in my apartment and asked to draw or collage or do whatever on their own drawing while I am away. I walk out and I leave them with their portrait and all my art supplies and see what's happened when I come back. So this is Finn Enke. This is Alice Shepard. Just astonishing dancer, MacArthur Genius level performer. This is Leonard Davis. So a lot of what you're seeing are things that my sitters added themselves to the drawings. This is a painting of, oh gosh, too many stories. Carrie Sandall, the famous disability activist Alice Wong. After COVID robbed me of the ability to have people in my studio. I panicked for quite a while. And then I started to work over Zoom. And so this is one of the Zoom portraits. This is Alice Wong, completely done on this from this laptop from which I'm speaking. You can see that I drew the edges of my screen as I saw it when I, was working with Zoom, the part of my screen that I could still see. Gosh, if you've read the book, this is Will Fugo, my college boyfriend. So we're still close. He came to visit me right before everything shut down. So we did a collaborative self-portrait or portrait over the mail, mailing pieces back and forth. This was done the same way, mailing pieces back and forth after Achi had sat for me right before the shutdown. Another Zoom portrait. Details. And that's it. So thank you for bearing with me. I'm going to go back to regular view. And hi. So I hope you have things on your mind.
Thank you so much, Riva. First, I have to say, I like your choice in reading glasses.
Thank you.
Reasonable.
Yes, here for Warby Parker.
Yep, exactly. So I think we had a request from Jordana to ask a question.
Yeah, is it okay if I just talk as opposed to write something down? So Riva, I did read the book. I don't know who else had, but I really loved it. I think I had either, I can't remember, read an interview with you and an article, or maybe I heard something on the radio and, got the book. I don't think, I hesitate because when you said you don't want to give anything away in the book, but it's not like suspense. So I don't feel like I'm going to be giving anything away. I mean, I love a couple of places.
Stop you for a moment.
Okay.
There's two things I don't talk about. So if you start to, if this is one of those, I will just very politely say different questions, but go on.
So one thing I was struck by in the book when you were, there's the first part of the book is all about your development and childhood. And I was really struck by just that time period and the perseverance of your mom and the, just sort of the, like, how, the interesting school that you went to, like the, it just highlighted the essential importance and for early childhood intervention, and also just like the incredible advocacy that she did to allow you to have us, prosper and, just realize who you are and what your talents were. And I thought I found the school to be so unique for its time. And I'm wondering if is that something that you ever comment on, that piece of your journey of learning through that place, and if there are.
Comment in what way? I mean, I write pretty extensively about Condon.
Yeah.
I am hoping someday that a grad student will do a study on it, because I have a ton of material, research that I did that didn't make it into the book. A lot of the history of Cincinnati and how Condon School ended up existing, which was very different from what I expected. But I also talk a lot about the problems of mainstreaming. That to me, I'm not anti-mainstreaming, but what tends to happen is that I went to a school where I was surrounded by, excuse me 1 second, I'm going to ask them to be a little quiet. 1 second, sorry.
You're muted now, Riva.
no adults anywhere, just screaming children. So, nothing I can do. So what I was saying is that to me, a lot of the problem is that kids don't get to have social contact with a range of disabilities. They might be in a club or a camp or something that's just their disability, which isn't that common, but they exist. But generally the pressure is to be as normal as, you're just like everybody else. But, what really saved me was having a sense of community and a larger view of what it meant to live differently, and to understand that I shared a lot of experience. Kids can hit these notes, man. I'm waiting for the screen on my laptop to just shatter. Anyway, they're so siloed. They're so, trying so hard to be a normal kid, whatever that is. But a lot of what happens, from what I've heard, is that when you hit puberty and teenage years, that the judgments really start again, that you're kind of accepted up until that point, but because dating and who you like and stuff is so fraught as a teenager, that these kids sometimes just fall off the edge. Also, they don't know their history. They don't know their culture. They don't know the politics. They don't know, no one teaches them. Nobody exposes them. So if kids are going to be mainstreamed, my most sincere wish is that curricula start to include this. I mean, we see it with so many other communities where kids are taught their history and the civil rights movements. And we have a massive civil rights movement with some incredible people, and nobody knows who any of them are. So, not that I was taught that at Condon, but I did get a grounding in the variance of difference. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
More questions, thoughts?
Yes. So I actually have one with a little bit of background. I was born with spina bifida about 24 years after you. And I think that difference in time accounts for a lot of different life experiences, different perspective. I was essentially mainstreamed for most of my schooling, and I come up with a different perspective on it. But in light of your perspective, do you, to the extent that you can explain or relate to something you haven't experienced, do you feel that your path has restricted you or opportunities? People's perceptions of you, maybe?
I think I carry a lot of internalized ableism. I think that it's not that I recommend my path. I wouldn't say that. But I'd like to hear what your perspective is. I'm more interested in that than what is your perspective.
So, in short, these are things I haven't necessarily communicated much. I'm still formulating the answers to this, but essentially, I couldn't imagine not being mainstreamed, and I disagree with the idea you presented on the culture aspect, because I don't see disability as my culture. I see Judaism as my culture and my history, for example, because my family is Jewish, my ancestors were Jewish, and it's something it's like disability. It's something I engage with every day. But the reality is that there were few, if any, other disabled people in my life, and that's just the nature of the general population. That there are fewer than living in a Jewish family, for example, when all the members are Jewish. So it seems natural to me that disability would take a backseat to other aspects.
There's nothing wrong with that. I don't hear anything negative. I mean, the writer Andrew Solomon has wrote a book called Far from the Tree. And in it, he talks about horizontal and vertical identity. And if I remember right, horizontal identity is the one that you inherit from your family. So I am also fully, Jewish. All my ancestors are Jewish. However, my experience of it is that Judaism had no interest in me. I wasn't sent to cheder. I wasn't educated at all. Every other kid that I knew, every single one, went to cheder, had bar and bat mitzvah, whole thing. I was not, because the idea, I guess, was that Judaism is about making more Jews, and nobody wanted me to make more Jews. So it's very painful. I mean, that said, I certainly strongly identify with being Jewish, but I wasn't embraced at all. I mean, people were nice to me. I don't mean like people were like, get out of here. But it was just this thing that, my brothers and cousins and neighbors and all were educated, all of them. So, so anyway, getting back to Andrew Solomon, so horizontal identity is the one that you receive. So your family culture, your religion, your location on earth, the values of your specific family, things like that, you inherit. It passes down. But if you are not like the other people in your family in some way, and you try to understand what it means to be different, whether you're queer or I'm just blanking on, certainly disabled. If your talents are something that have no precedent whatsoever in your family, then you go vertical and you start looking for other people like you to reflect you and to give you context. And so for me, that's, I certainly have a lot of my family culture in me, not necessarily Judaism, but the values of my family are very strong in me. But between being queer and being Jewish and being an artist, I had to move laterally in order to find context and understanding of myself. And I'm not anti-mainstreaming. That's not what I said.
Right.
What I said is that it frustrates me that disabled kids are not given any information at all about their history or where the rights came from or who fought for them or how much they're being degraded, just to start, much less all of the film and books and dance and plays and, everything out there exploring what it means to be the different one in your family, the different one in your neighborhood. So I find that work that those people are doing indispensable. But we all need different things. And so if Judaism has given you a sense of belonging and helped you interpret your life and you feel connected, that's all a person needs.
That gives me a lot to think about in terms of. Solomon's book is one that I took a note on when I was reading yours, in particular.
Yeah,
it gives me a lot.
A friend. He's amazing. More questions?
Yes. So Lois is asking, why did you choose the title? Could you speak more about the golem and?
Yeah. So When I was younger, before I knew the story of the golem, I felt more connected to the story of Frankenstein. I've had several dozen surgeries. I've been in the hospital over 300 times. I've had a ton of medical interventions. It doesn't end. It doesn't end. And so I've always felt as constructed as I am born. And so the story of Frankenstein was painful, but also seemed to call to me. Later, when I was a teenager, I think I was a teenager, maybe my first year in college, I think, I saw the silent film, Der Golem. And it wasn't like an immediate transition, but the more I thought about, especially once I started to deal with disability in my work, the more the story of the golem made more sense to me, because, well, of course, Judaism, but also, I mean, they're basically the same story. Golems completely permeate our culture. So, you have Der Golem, but you also have, of course, Frankenstein and Pinocchio and Mr. Data on Star Trek and the Borg on Star Trek and, all of the Chucky movies, the animated dolls. And I mean, the gingerbread man, it's the body that is brought to life through unnatural means, mystical or supernatural or strange science. That is the story of the golem, that someone has a need and they engender this body for their own purposes in certain ways. So, for instance, when I've spoken to my doctors about why they made certain decisions about my surgical life, I asked them, were you thinking about the life that I might have? Like, were you trying to give me a certain kind of life? Or was it more about what was feasible surgically? Were you really thinking about where medicine was? And most of them have answered it really was about what was medically feasible. They really were not thinking about me as a future person so much. So that is very much like these constructed body stories, because in all of the stories of the golem, body is animated. It's meant to serve a purpose. It outgrows its ability to be controlled, and most of the time it's destroyed or banished, something like that. And my interpretation of that was not that I was banished, but that I was built for this world that didn't want me or need me. I mean, like I said, almost everybody like me was institutionalized. I had to fight for everything once I left Condon. And while I wasn't literally destroyed, it was like, well, there I was in the world with no purpose, with no way of being like other people. So in Stories of the Golem, where the constructed body becomes accepted, it always sort of, I think of Mr. Data on Star Trek, because there are two Datas in the story. As you get there is an evil Data, and evil Data wants to just please himself, and good Data serves the Enterprise. And I wasn't sure who to be, whether to live in my anger or try and be a goody two shoes or what? And my solution was really to be an artist, which is its own thing. It's half one thing and half another. But that's the closest I can really explain to why. And I could speak a lot about the story of the golem because there's a lot of ethical underpinning in the 16th century folktale and the way that it's been interpreted over the centuries by Jewish culture. There's a book just called The Golem, which has dozens of short stories and plays and art, essays about how Jews have interpreted the golem. It's like Frankenstein. It's really about, well, the story of Frankenstein, I would just say, is the story of a parent who cannot love its strange child. It's the failure of parenting. And in the golem, it's the same. The golem wants to be accepted into the community, wants to learn and become a Jew, but it's unacceptable, and eventually it's destroyed. It's seen as not having a soul. And that is something much here. Hang on a second. I'm sorry, this is too much. Oh, God. I give up. There's just, I can't get anyone's attention. It's like this every Sunday. Screaming, lots of screaming. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. I think we're probably pretty close to time. I can take one more question and then I think I'll release us all into the wild. Any other questions? Or
I'll ask a quick one. You spoke a little bit about your work during the pandemic, and I wanted you to say a little bit more because in some ways it kind of equalized people because no one was going out of their house. And, you know, I certainly read, and yet at the same time, people felt isolated and different and all kinds of issues. So I was wondering if you went to a deeper place, if they went, the people you were doing the art with, how it affected you as an artist and as a person in terms of that time.
hello? Sorry, someone banging on my door. I'm sorry for doing this here today. There are reasons I had to come here, but I'm not going to do this again. I wouldn't say that it was deeper. I would say that it was hard to find a way of becoming as intimate at first, working over Zoom as what's happens in my actual studio, which I haven't really talked about. The studio is kind of a sacred place for me, and it's very sheltered, and the exchanges that happen there are profoundly important. I'm grateful that I've been able to work over Zoom. I'm doing something else now, but I'm sure I'll go back to it at some point. But I have to refute the idea that it equalized people, because what it did to the disability community, at least a lot of the people I know, people who need like personal assistance, who need to go out and get regular medical care. I had several friends die because their PA stopped showing up. I had friends like Alice, whose portrait you saw with the BiPAP on, struggled to get her oxygen. She's on regular lifelong oxygen support. And there were moments she couldn't get her oxygen delivered. They did not include us in the rollout to the vaccine. I was part of a group here in Chicago that raised holy hell to finally get us on the list to be vaccinated but I don't know if people remember, we weren't on it in any city except San Francisco. Everybody else in the country just said, disabled people, just stay in your house, just stay in your house. And everybody, I have major vulnerabilities. I mean, look, disability is a huge category. It's almost 1/4 of our country. It encompasses a lot of things. Some conditions make you more vulnerable, some don't. Some affect how you can be in the world, some really don't, as on a regular basis. But for people who really depend on societal support, this has been incredibly hard, not only because we couldn't get our services or go out and see our doctors because we were terrified to go to the hospital. The hospital is full of COVID patients, but we're supposed to be getting regular treatment from what? How do we even? The doctors were saying, don't come unless it's emergency. Honest to God, doctors were saying, just don't come unless you cannot avoid it. So, and in some ways that isn't so different still. And we're about to go into another surge, and our country is being insane and acting like the pandemic is over, which, yeah, right. I have written some essays talking about the fact that it was really clear in the beginning that we were not valued and that we've had to fight to be valued. And that the pandemic to me is, well, it's a result in part of climate change. And as climate change revs up, my big fear is that we're going to see ourselves more and more discounted, that we're going to go back to a time where we're just not valued because things will become scarcer, either real or in perception, like the toilet paper thing, that partly was just a delusion. There was toilet paper most places, but people did things so that all of a sudden there wasn't toilet paper. They caused their own crisis. I'm really afraid, and I'm really angry at seeing how we were treated and feeling really edgy about whether that's going to come back. So I've been doing more public speaking than usual. I've written several essays for the New York Times. It hasn't stopped my practice, but it's made me furious and scared. So I'm sorry to end like that, but it's serious. And I just want the world to show us that we're of value. That's what I'm trying.
Thank you so much, Riva. We really appreciate you sharing your experiences and your thoughts with us today. Thank you also to
I
Jack.
I don't think there's anything to be apologized for.
Thank
That
you.
we've apologized. These are scary times, very scary. And
And
if
my
anything, it's going to exacerbate differences in society.
Well, the last thing I'll say is, there's a rise of right-wing and repressive governments all over the world. And, God knows what's going to happen with the next election. And those are not governments that care about the vulnerable. They are not. So, as they rise across Europe and Asia and Africa, everywhere, there are right-wing governments. South America, my God. And they just are not people who care about the vulnerable. So fight, people, fight, okay? Really fight. So anyway, I'm gonna shut up again.
Well, just in closing, I want to thank Jack and Lana from Jewish for Good, as well as Bethel Synagogue and the Lifelong Learning Committee for coming together to produce this Jewish Authors Book Festival and bringing Riva to us today. The next program in our series is at 7 p.m. and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.
Take care. Be well, everyone.
You too.
Thank you.